November 1944. A holding pen somewhere outside Aachen, Germany, the air tasting of coal smoke and frozen mud. A captured Wehrmacht sergeant named Heinrich Brandt, 26 years old, 3 years on the Eastern Front before the Western collapse, pulled him here, sat across a small table from an American intelligence officer who expected to spend the afternoon extracting tactical information about troop dispositions and supply lines. That is not what happened. The officer, following a new directive from the Psychological Warfare Division, had been instructed to ask a different set of questions. Not where are your reserves, not which roads are mined. Instead, something that struck the officer as almost embarrassingly soft. What broke your men's will to resist? Brandt was not hostile. He was tired in the specific way that men get tired when something they believed in has quietly stopped being believable. He answered without much resistance. He talked about artillery. He talked about air superiority. He talked about logistics, the American capacity to replace equipment that still felt, to men who had watched the German supply system deteriorate for 2 years, like something close to a conjuring trick. And then he stopped. He looked at the table for a moment, and he said something the officer wrote down almost verbatim, because he was not sure he had understood it correctly. He said the mail was worse than the shells. Not the physical mail, not letters being used as some kind of weapon. He meant the fact of it, the visible, constant, almost contemptuous regularity with which American soldiers received letters from home in forward positions. In foxholes, at the front, under conditions where German soldiers had not received reliable correspondence in months. He said watching American soldiers read letters in the field was a particular kind of psychological damage that he did not have a clean word for. It made his men feel, he said, like they were already ghosts. Like the world back home had already moved on without them. Like they were fighting for a country that had stopped writing back. The officer filed the report. It joined a growing stack of similar testimonies that were beginning to tell a story nobody had set out to find. This is that story. Part 1. The science of why men keep fighting. The question of what sustains combat motivation has been studied seriously since the American Civil War, and the answers have consistently surprised the people asking. Generals and politicians in every era have assumed that men fight for ideology, for national pride, for fear of punishment, for hatred of the enemy. These forces exist, but the research, and the research is extensive, keeps pointing somewhere else. In the 1940s, the United States Army had a functioning social science apparatus that most armies in history did not. The research branch of the Army's Morale Division employed sociologists, psychologists, and statisticians who spent the war conducting surveys, processing after-action interviews, and analyzing what separated units that held from units that broke. The work was eventually published as a multi-volume study called The American Soldier, compiled by Samuel Stouffer and his colleagues at the research branch. It remains one of the most detailed empirical portraits of combat psychology ever assembled. Hold that name. Samuel Stouffer, 43 years old in 1944, a sociologist from Sac City, Iowa, who had spent the Depression studying unemployment and who brought to the Army the same empirical rigidity he brought to everything else. He was not a soldier. He was a man who believed that if you asked enough people the right questions, patterns would emerge that intuition alone could never find. Stouffer's researchers asked American soldiers in every theater what mattered most to their morale. The answers were not what senior commanders expected. Ideology ranked low. Hatred of the enemy ranked low. Abstract concepts like democracy and freedom ranked low. What ranked highest, consistently, across theater and rank and background, was something the researchers labeled primary group cohesion, the bonds between a soldier and the 8 or 10 men immediately around him, and, directly connected to it, the maintenance of connection to home. Остановитесь на этом. Stop and sit with that. The thing that kept American soldiers fighting was not what they were fighting for in the abstract. It was the specific, named people they were fighting for, and the specific, named people watching their backs. The squad. The family. the letters that proved both still existed. This was not a new insight in the abstract. Armies have always understood that homesick soldiers are ineffective soldiers. But what the American Army did that was genuinely unprecedented was treat this insight as an engineering problem. If connection to home was the fuel, then the logistics of maintaining that connection became a military priority equivalent to the logistics of ammunition and rations. The question was not, should we let soldiers get mail? The question was, how do we build a system that delivers mail to a foxhole in France as reliably as we deliver rifle rounds? The answer took 3 years to build and involved a workforce of thousands. The Army Postal Service had existed in one form or another since the Revolutionary War, but the version that fought World War II was a different organism entirely. By 1943, the Army Postal Service employed more than 17,000 military personnel and operated in every theatre simultaneously. Its central facility in New York City processed an average of 2 million pieces of mail per day during peak periods. 2 million, every day. Parcels, letters, V-mail, the microfilmed letter system introduced in 1942 specifically to reduce shipping weight and volume. Here is the engineering problem they solved. A single division of 15,000 men, if each soldier received 1 letter per week, required 15,000 letters per week just to maintain baseline mail contact. Multiply that across the nearly 8 million Americans who served in World War II, and you have a logistics challenge that dwarfs almost anything else in the war except ammunition. The Army solved it with a combination of air transport, dedicated postal units attached to every division, and a sorting system that could track a letter from a zip code in the United States to a specific company-level mailbox in a forward area. The system was not perfect. It broke down in fast-moving operations. It broke down in some Pacific Island campaigns where the terrain made forward delivery almost impossible. But in the European theatre, particularly from 1943 onward, it worked at a level that astonished everyone who studied it, including the Germans. Meet Private First Class Russell Doherty, 20 years old, from Lebanon, Pennsylvania, formerly a hardware store clerk. Assigned to the 30th Infantry Division, which fought from Normandy through the Siegfried Line. Doherty left a collection of letters home that were donated to the National Archives by his family after his death in 1997. In one letter, written from somewhere in France in the autumn of 1944, the censor has blacked out the location. He wrote to his mother, "Got 3 letters from you today and 1 from Aunt Helen. Tell her the cookies were still mostly okay, even after the trip. It takes the edge off. I don't know how to explain it any better than that. It just takes the edge off. It takes the edge off." That phrase from a 20-year-old hardware store clerk from Pennsylvania is a more precise description of the psychological mechanism than anything in Stouffer's academic volumes. Connection to home did not solve the problem of being in a foxhole in France in November. It did not make the artillery quiet. It did not make the mud dry or the cold warm. It took the edge off. It maintained the thread. It reminded a soldier that the world he was fighting to get back to still existed, and still remembered him specifically, by name, as a person rather than a serial number. The Germans had no equivalent system, not in 1944, not really at any point in the war. The Wehrmacht's postal system, the Feldpost, was not incompetent. In the early years of the war, from 1939 through 1941, it functioned reasonably well. German soldiers on the Western Front in 1940 could receive letters from home within a week. But the Feldpost was built for a short war. It was built for the Blitzkrieg model: rapid campaigns, clear front lines, predictable logistics chains. It was not built for a multi-front war of attrition across 4,000 miles of contested territory. By 1943, the Feldpost was visibly struggling. The Eastern Front alone consumed the system. Soldiers in Stalingrad were receiving mail in batches, nothing for 6 weeks, then a pile of letters that arrived simultaneously, many of them from months earlier. By 1944, soldiers in Normandy were reporting gaps of 4 to 8 weeks between letters. By the winter of 1944–45, some units on the Western Front had effectively stopped receiving civilian mail at all. The system had not collapsed entirely, but it had degraded to the point where a German soldier could no longer assume that the thread connecting him to home was intact. This is the asymmetry that Allied intelligence kept noticing in prisoner interviews. Not the asymmetry of tanks or aircraft or artillery, those were obvious. The asymmetry of connection. Part 2. What the interrogators found. Allied prisoner interrogation in World War II was a sophisticated enterprise by 1944, and the Americans in particular had developed a taxonomy of prisoner types that shaped how interviews were conducted. The most analytically useful prisoners were not the ones who gave up order of battle information. That information had a short shelf life. The most useful prisoners were the ones who could articulate in detail what had changed in their unit's morale over time and why. These conversations produced a recurring pattern. The systematic collection of this pattern began in earnest after D-Day. The 1st United States Army's G2 section, the intelligence branch, maintained a prisoner interrogation center that processed thousands of German soldiers captured in Normandy and the subsequent breakout. The interrogators were trained to distinguish between tactical information, which went immediately to operational planners, and what the reports called morale intelligence, which went to a separate analytical section that tracked trends across weeks and months. The morale intelligence reports from the summer and autumn of 1944 are remarkable documents. They are cold, precise, and in places almost clinical in the way they describe the psychological unraveling of the German army in the West. Meet 2nd Lieutenant Albert Folsom, 24 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey, a former school teacher who had studied German at Rutgers before the war and who was assigned to the 1st Army's prisoner interrogation section in the summer of 1944. Folsom processed somewhere between 300 and 400 prisoners between July and November of that year. His personal reports, preserved in the National Archives collection at College Park, Maryland, show a man who was methodical, patient, and genuinely curious about the human beings sitting across the table from him. Folsom noticed the male pattern in August of 1944. He had been asking a standard follow-up question. What did you observe about the morale of American units you encountered or observed? And he began to notice that a significant proportion of German prisoners, when pressed for specifics, mentioned male. Not always in the same words. Not always as the primary factor, but with a frequency that he found statistically striking. He wrote in one of his reports dated the 14th of August 1944, prisoner after prisoner, when asked to describe the observable difference in spirit between German and American forces, returns unprompted to the subject of male. They have seen Americans reading letters in positions that would be considered dangerously exposed by German standards. They interpret this as a sign not of carelessness, but of confidence, that the Americans feel secure enough in their position to sit in the open and read. Several prisoners have specifically stated that the sight of American soldiers receiving and reading mail in forward positions was more demoralizing than artillery, because artillery they could respond to, the mail they could not. Read that last sentence again. Artillery they could respond to, the mail they could not. What Folsom had identified, without the vocabulary of modern psychology, was the difference between a stressor that activates agency and a stressor that demonstrates powerlessness. When German soldiers were shelled, they could dig deeper, move positions, return fire, call for their own artillery. They had responses available. When they watched American soldiers receive mail, when they understood that those men across the wire were connected to a functioning world that remembered them, while they themselves had not heard from their families in 2 months, there was nothing to do. No response, no countermeasure, no way to close the gap. Folsom escalated his finding to his section chief. It was incorporated into a wider analysis that eventually reached the psychological warfare branch of SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, where it became part of the evidence base for a specific propaganda operation. But we'll come to that. First, understand the scale of what Folsom was documenting. The German army in the West in the autumn of 1944 was not a demoralized rabble. That is a myth that post-war histories have largely corrected. The divisions that fought in Normandy, that conducted the fighting withdrawal through France and Belgium, that manned the Siegfried Line. These were experienced, often elite formations that by any objective standard fought with extraordinary tenacity against overwhelming material superiority. The fact that they kept fighting under those conditions was itself evidence of the resilience of the German military system. But resilience has a structure, and the structure of German military resilience in World War II rested on a specific set of psychological pillars. Stouffer's American research identified primary group cohesion as the foundation of combat motivation. German military sociology, and the Germans had their own version of this research, though less systematic, identified something similar. The German soldier fought for his Kameradschaft, his comrades, the men immediately around him, not for Hitler, not for the Reich in the abstract, for the specific 8 men in his section. The male disruption attacked this structure from an unexpected angle. When letters stopped coming, the primary group, the squad, the section, became the soldier's entire world. This sounds like it would strengthen unit cohesion. In the short term, it sometimes did. Men who have only each other do sometimes bond more tightly. But the research, both Allied and German, showed that the longer the isolation from home continued, the more the primary group dynamic changed character. Men became more anxious about their family's safety in the bombing campaign, more uncertain about what they were returning to, more susceptible to the specific fear that the world they were fighting for had already moved on without them. This fear had a name in the German prisoner interviews. The interrogators at First Army called it the Heimatangst cluster, the anxiety about home. It showed up in prisoner statements as a specific articulable concern, not just "I miss my family," but "I don't know if my family is alive." German cities were being bombed systematically by 1944. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Dortmund, all under repeated attack. A German soldier who had not received a letter in 6 weeks did not know whether his silence was the result of the postal system's collapse or whether his family's house had been destroyed. American soldiers had this anxiety too, but they had a counter to it. The letter that arrived in the foxhole was evidence. It was dated. It was written in the handwriting of a specific person. It said, "I am alive. I am here. I am thinking of you." The German soldier in the winter of 1944 had no equivalent evidence. He had silence. Silence, it turned out, was one of the most effective weapons in the Allied arsenal, and it was entirely unintentional. Part 3. The propaganda men learn what they have. The Psychological Warfare Division of SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, was not a small operation. By the summer of 1944, it employed over 1,000 personnel, operated printing presses capable of producing tens of millions of leaflets per week, and broadcast radio programming in German around the clock. The division was led by Brigadier General Robert McClure, a careful, methodical officer who had spent months building a team that combined military intelligence, academic social science, and practical journalism. McClure's team included some remarkable people. One of them was Hans Haber, born János Bekesi, 31 years old in 1944, a Hungarian-born Austrian journalist who had served in the French army, been captured, escaped, and eventually made his way to the United States, where he was recruited specifically for his ability to think like a German reader. Haber understood German psychology, not as an outsider studying it, but as someone who had grown up inside the culture and then watched it collapse into something unrecognizable. Haber and his colleagues had been wrestling with a fundamental problem of psychological warfare. What do you say to a German soldier that he will actually believe? The standard Allied leaflets of 1943 and early 1944 had been largely ineffective. They relied on 2 approaches: atrocity documentation and rational choice appeals, and both failed for the same reason. German soldiers had been trained to distrust Allied propaganda, and they applied that distrust broadly. A leaflet telling them that Germany was losing the war was dismissed as exactly the kind of thing the enemy would say whether it was true or not. The mail intelligence from Folsom and from similar interrogation reports across the theatre gave Haber's team something different. It gave them a vulnerability that was not ideological. It was not about politics or military strategy. It was about a specific, concrete human experience that every German soldier understood, waiting for a letter that never came. In the autumn of 1944, the Psychological Warfare Division began producing a series of leaflets and radio broadcasts that addressed the mail disruption directly. Not by claiming that Germany was losing, the soldiers already suspected that, by acknowledging, in a tone of almost sympathetic precision, exactly what the German soldier was experiencing and exactly why. One of the radio scripts from this period, broadcast on the Allied-operated Soldatensender Calais, a station designed to sound like a legitimate German military broadcast, included a passage that interrogators later confirmed was referenced spontaneously by multiple prisoners. The passage ran approximately as follows, translated from the original German. Your family has not stopped writing. They write every week. The letters are sitting in a postal depot in Cologne or Frankfurt or wherever the trains still run, waiting for a connection that no longer exists. They are thinking of you. They just cannot reach you, and you cannot reach them. And the men across from you, the Americans, they got 3 letters yesterday. Hold that image. The leaflets did not need to lie. The situation they described was accurate. The postal system was failing. Families were writing. Letters were piling up in depots that had been disrupted by bombing, by the collapse of rail lines, by the general administrative deterioration of a German state fighting on 3 fronts simultaneously. The propaganda operation's insight was simply to name what German soldiers already knew, and to name it in the same breath as the contrast. And the Americans got 3 letters yesterday. This contrast was not invented, it was documented. The speed and reliability of the American postal system in the European theatre had reached a level by the autumn of 1944 that was, by historical standards, extraordinary. The Army's official statistics for the period show average delivery times from the continental United States to forward units in France of between 7 and 14 days. 7 to 14 days. From a kitchen table in Ohio to a foxhole in the Hurtgen forest. Not always, not for every letter, but as a median performance. The Germans knew this because they watched it happen. Prisoners consistently reported that they had observed, from their own positions, through binoculars, from captured positions, American soldiers receiving and opening mail in forward areas. Some described specific details: a soldier sitting on a tank reading a letter, a group of men gathered around a package, someone holding up a photograph. These were not propaganda images. They were real scenes that German soldiers had actually witnessed, which is precisely what made them so effective as demoralizers. One prisoner captured near Aachen in October of 1944, his name appears in the interrogation record only as Gefreiter H. A corporal, 23 years old, from Breslau, gave an account that appears in multiple secondary histories of Allied psychological warfare. He said, through an interpreter, that he had watched an American soldier on the opposite side of a road junction spend what appeared to be 20 minutes reading a single letter, then fold it carefully and put it in his breast pocket. He said he had watched this and thought, that man has somewhere to go back to. The letter proves it. He knows it still exists. Gefreiter H. surrendered 4 days later. The Psychological Warfare Division's analysis of this phenomenon produced a document in November of 1944 that circulated internally under the title Mail as a Morale Factor, Summary of Prisoner Intelligence. The document ran to 31 pages and synthesized interrogation reports from across the theatre. Its central finding was stated with a directness unusual for official military documents. The maintenance of regular mail contact with home appears to function in the American soldier as a continuous renewal of the psychological contract that justifies continued combat. The disruption of equivalent contact in German forces appears to accelerate the dissolution of this contract at a rate that is not proportional to the disruption's severity. Small disruptions produce disproportionate morale effects. The implication is that the German soldier's psychological resilience is more dependent on home contact than German military doctrine has anticipated. Disproportionate morale effects from small disruptions. That is a precise way of saying they were more fragile than they looked. And here is what the intelligence officers did not fully understand at the time. The male asymmetry was not just a morale factor. It was a signal. It told German soldiers something about the fundamental nature of their situation that no amount of tactical briefing could convey. When a soldier receives mail reliably, it means the logistical chain behind him is intact. It means the administrative apparatus of his army is functioning. It means the state that sent him to fight is still organized enough to route a letter to a specific foxhole. When mail stops, all of these things are in question. Mail is not just a morale tool, it is evidence of institutional health. German soldiers in the winter of 1944 were reading the silence correctly. If you are keeping count, here is what that means. The mail disruption was not just making German soldiers miss their families, it was confirming, through the most personal possible channel, what the bombing and the retreats and the fuel shortages and the officer casualties were also suggesting. That the system they were part of was failing. And across the wire, the Americans were getting 3 letters a day. The Americans, for their part, were not thinking about this as a weapon. That is the crucial detail. The American postal system was not built to demoralize the enemy. It was built to sustain American soldiers. The demoralizing effect on German forces was entirely secondary, a side effect observed by intelligence officers and then, partially, deliberately amplified by psychological warfare operations. But the original system existed because American military planners had made a specific decision that the morale of their own soldiers was a military resource worth enormous logistical investment. That decision had been made years earlier in a building far from any foxhole. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The phenomenon that Karl-Heinz Brenner described in that processing facility near Jülich, the thing that broke him faster than Shellfire, was not an accident of war, and it was not a uniquely German weakness. It was the predictable output of 2 different institutional decisions made years before anyone fired a shot in Europe. The first decision was American. In the years between the wars, and accelerating sharply after Pearl Harbor, the United States Army made a series of choices about how to treat the psychological needs of soldiers that were, in historical context, remarkable. The Army funded Stouffer's research branch. It took the findings seriously. It built the postal infrastructure not as a luxury, but as a logistical necessity equivalent to food and ammunition. It assigned dedicated postal personnel to forward units. It developed V-mail to solve the volume problem. It set delivery time targets and tracked performance against them. None of this was inevitable. Every other major army in World War II treated mail as an administrative function. Important, but not strategic. The American army treated it as a weapons system. The second decision was German. The Wehrmacht, for reasons rooted in its institutional culture and in the specific nature of National Socialist governance, did not develop the equivalent capacity. This was partly resource constraints. By 1943, Germany was genuinely struggling to maintain basic logistics across its fronts, and civilian mail was always going to lose priority contests to ammunition and fuel. But it was also partly a doctrinal blind spot. German military culture, with its emphasis on Auftragstaktik, mission-oriented tactics, individual initiative, the soldier as a self-sufficient actor, tended to underestimate the degree to which even the most capable soldier needed external validation of his purpose. The German system trained men to function with minimal guidance from above. It did not adequately account for the psychological cost of functioning with minimal connection to below, to the civilian world, the family, the evidence that home still existed. This is not a moral failing, it is an institutional one. The Wehrmacht was an extraordinarily capable fighting force that lost the war for reasons that included, but were not limited to, the psychological asymmetry documented in these prisoner reports. The mail gap was one thread in a much larger unraveling, but it is a thread that deserves examination, precisely because it reveals something about the nature of institutional care. The American army, in building its postal system, was making an implicit argument that the soldier's connection to home was the army's responsibility to maintain, not the soldier's problem to manage alone. This was, in retrospect, one of the more sophisticated psychological insights in the history of military organization. It cost money and personnel and shipping capacity. It paid back in the currency that matters most in a long war, the willingness of individual soldiers to keep going when the rational calculation says stop. Albert Folsom, the school teacher from Cranford, New Jersey, who first systematically documented the male pattern in his prisoner reports, was discharged from the army in the spring of 1945. He returned to teaching in New Jersey and died in 1983 at the age of 63. His interrogation reports sat in the National Archives for decades, filed under the uninviting heading Morale Intelligence, European Theatre. They are not famous documents. They were never meant to be. They were working papers written by a careful man who asked good questions and wrote down what he heard. What he heard, over and over, from men sitting across a table after surrendering, was a version of the same confession. Not about tactics, not about strategy, about a letter that never came. Russell Doherty, the hardware store clerk from Lebanon, Pennsylvania, survived the war. He returned home in the summer of 1945, went back to work in his family's hardware store, married in 1947, and died in Lebanon in 1997 at the age of 73. His letters home are in a box in the National Archives. The cookies were still mostly okay even after the trip, and Karl-Heinz Brenner, the postal clerk from Dortmund who walked out of his trench at first light with his hands raised, his name appears only in one American intelligence report, a single page, filed and forgotten. What became of him after the processing facility is not documented. Whether he made it back to Dortmund, whether Dortmund still had anything to go back to, whether the 11 weeks of silence meant what he feared it meant. The record ends there, but the record before that end is precise enough. He had watched the Americans reading their letters in the early morning. He had understood what it meant that they could do that, and he could not. He had walked out alone while the men on either side of him were sleeping, and he had raised his hands. And when an American intelligence officer asked him when he had decided, he had thought about it for a long moment and said it wasn't the bombing, it wasn't the cold. He was a postal clerk before the war. He knew better than most what the silence meant. The Americans had solved the problem the Germans had not admitted was a problem. They had decided that a letter from a mother in Ohio was worth routing through 2,000 miles of wartime logistics to reach a specific man in a specific foxhole. They had decided that the thread connecting a soldier to his reason for fighting was not a private matter, but a military one. They had decided to maintain it. That decision did not win the war by itself, but it contributed to the winning of it in ways that no battle map can show. It shows up instead in the interrogation reports, in the quiet confessions of men who had been broken, not by what the Americans did to them, but by what the Americans had that they didn't. A letter, dated, in someone's handwriting, proof that home still existed. If this investigation gave you something you hadn't considered before, the specific, unglamorous logistical decision that turned mail into a military advantage, press the like button. It keeps this kind of history visible a little longer, and that matters. He was a postal clerk from Dortmund. He knew exactly what was missing.